wish you could feel the texture. It's really one of my favorites, but let's just go ahead and show you what it's all about. Let's start from the very beginning. Fairy tale, a novel. Now it starts with a quote that says, "And always let your conscience be your guide," from the Blue Fairy. This is something to think about in your everyday life, and I fully agree with it as well. Something that you should live by. Chapter 1. The Gotham Bridge. The Miracle. The Howling. I'm sure I can tell this story. I'm also sure no one will believe it. That's fine with me. Telling it will be enough. My problem, and I'm sure many writers have it, not just newbies like me, is deciding where to start. My first thought was with the shed, because that's where my adventures really began. But then I realized I would have to tell about Mr. Bowditch first, and how we became close. Only that never would have happened except for the miracle that happened to my father. A very ordinary miracle, you could say. One that's happened to many thousands of men and women since 1935. But it seemed like a miracle to a kid. Only that isn't the right place either, because I don't think my father would have needed a miracle if it hadn't been for that goddamned bridge. So that's where I needed to start. With the goddamned Sycamore Street bridge. And now, thinking of those things, I see a clear thread leading up through the years to Mr. Bowditch and the padlocked shed behind his ramshackle old Victorian. But a thread is easy to break. So not a thread, but a chain, a strong one. And I was the kid with the shackle clamped around his wrist. The Little Rumple River runs through the north end of Century's Rest, known to the locals as Century, and until the year 1996, the year I was born, it was spanned by a wooden bridge. That was the year the state inspectors from the Department of Highway Transportation looked it over and deemed it unsafe. People in our part of Century had known that since '82, my father said. The bridge was posted for none, for 10,000 pounds. But townies with a fully loaded up pickup truck mostly steered clear of it, opting for the turnpike extension, which was an annoying and time-consuming detour. My dad said you could feel the planks shiver and shake and rumble under you even in a car. It was dangerous. The state inspectors were right about that, but here's the irony. If the old wooden bridge had never been replaced by one made of steel, my mother might still be alive. The Little Rumple really is little, and putting up the new bridge didn't take long. The wooden span was demolished and the new one was opened to traffic in April of 1997. The mayor cut a ribbon. Father Coughlin blessed the goddamn thing, and that was that. My father said one night, he was pretty drunk at the time. Wasn't much of a blessing for us, Charlie, was it? It was named the Frank Ellsworth Bridge after a hometown hero who died in Vietnam, but the locals just called it the Sycamore Street Bridge. Sycamore Street was paved nice and smooth on both sides, but the bridge deck, 142 feet long, was steel grating that made a humming sound when cars went over it, and a rumble when trucks used it, which they could do because the bridge was now rated at 60,000 pounds. Not big enough for a loaded semi, but long haulers never used Sycamore Street anyway. is talk every year in the town council about paving the deck and adding at least one sidewalk. But every year it seemed like there were other places where the money was needed more urgently. I don't think a sidewalk would have saved my mother, but paving might have. There's no way to know, is there? That goddamn bridge. We lived halfway up the long length of Sycamore Street hill, about a quarter of a mile from the bridge. There was a little gas and convenience store on the other side called Sip Mart. It sold all the usual stuff, from motor oil to Wonder Bread to Little Debbie cakes, but it also sold fried chicken made by the proprietor, Mr. Eliades, known to the neighborhood as Mr. Zippy. That chicken was exactly what the sign in the window sold. The best in the land. I can still remember how tasty it was, but I never ate a single piece after my mom died. I would have gagged it up if I tried. One Saturday in November of 2003, the town council, still discussing paving the bridge and still deciding it could wait another year, my mother told us she was going to walk down the Zippy and get us fried chicken for dinner. My father and I were watching a college football game. "You should take the car," Dad said. "It's going to rain." "I need the exercise," Mom said, "but I'll wear my Little Red Riding Hood raincoat." And that's what she was wearing the last time I saw her. The hood wasn't up because it wasn't raining yet, so her hair was spilling over her shoulders. I was 7 years old and thought my mother had the world's most beautiful red hair. She saw me looking at her, though, through the window and waved. I waved back, then turned my attention to the TV where LSU was driving. I wish I'd looked longer, but I don't blame myself. You never know where the trapdoors are in your life, do you? It wasn't my fault, and it wasn't Dad's fault, although I know he blamed himself. Thought if only I'd given up off my dead ass and given her a ride to the damn store. It probably wasn't the fault of the man in the plumbing truck either. The cop said he was sober, and he swore he was keeping to the speed limit, which was 25 in our residential zone. Dad said that even if that were true, the man must have taken his eyes off the road, if only for a few seconds. Dad was probably right about that. He was an insurance claims adjuster, and he told me once that the only pure accident he ever heard of was a man in Arizona who was killed when a meteor hit him in the head. There's always someone at fault, Dad said, which is not the same as blame. Do you blame the man who hit Mom? I asked. He thought about it, raised his glass to his lips and drank. This was 6 or 8 months after Mom died, and he'd pretty much given up on beer. By then, he was strictly a Gilby's man. I try not to, and mostly I can do that unless I wake up at 2 in the morning with nobody in bed but me. Then I blame him. Mom walks down the hall. There was a sign where the sidewalk ended. She walked past the sign and crossed the bridge. By then it was getting dark and starting to drizzle. She went to the store, and Irina Eliades, of course known as Mississippi, told her more chicken was coming out in 3 minutes, 5 at the most. Somewhere on Pine Street, not far from our house, the plumber had just finished his last job of that Saturday and was putting his toolbox in the back of his panel van. The chicken came out hot and crispy and golden. Mississippi boxed up an 8-piece and gave Mom an extra wing to eat on her walk home. Mom thanked her, paid, and stopped to look at the magazine rack. If she hadn't done that, she might have made it all the way across the bridge. Who knows? The plumber's van must have been turning onto Sycamore Street was checking out the latest issue of People. She put it back, opened the door, and spoke to Mississippi over her shoulder. "Have a nice night." She might have cried out when she saw the van was going to hit her, and God knows what she might have been thinking. But those were her last words. She never spoke. She went out. The rain was coming down cold and steady by then, silvery lines in the glow of the one street light on the Zip Mart side of the bridge. Sorry. Munching on her chicken wing, my mother walked onto the street deck. Headlights picked her out and threw her shadow long behind her. The plumber passed the sign on the other side, the one that reads, "Bridge surface freezes before road. Please use caution." Was he looking in his rearview mirror? Maybe checking for messages on his phone? He said no to both. But when I think of what happened to her that night, I always think of my dad saying the only pure accident he ever heard of was the man who took a meteor to the head. There was plenty of room. The steel bridge was quite a bit wider than the wooden version had been. The problem was that steel grating. He saw my mother halfway across the bridge and hit the brake. Not because he was speeding, or so he said, but out of pure instinct. The steel surface had started to freeze. The panel truck skidded and slewed, starting to come sideways. Corn. My mother shrank against the bridge rail, dropping her little piece of chicken. The panel truck slewed further, struck her, and sent her spinning along the rail like a top. I don't want to think about the parts of her that were torn off in that death spin, but I'm hopeless not to sometimes. All I know is that the nose of the panel truck finally drove her into a bridge stanchion near the Zip Mart side of the bridge. Part of her went into the little rumble. Most of her stayed on the bridge. I carry a picture of us in my wallet. I was maybe 3 when it was taken. She's got me on her hip. One of my hands is in her hair. She had beautiful hair. Shitty Christmas that year. You better believe it. I remember the reception after the funeral. It was at our house. My father, who was there, greeting people and accepting condolences, and then he was gone. I asked his brother, my Uncle Bob, where he was. He had to lie down, Uncle Bob said. He was really worn out, Charlie. Why don't you go outside and play? I had never felt less like playing in my life, but I went outside. First time, sorry. I passed a bunch of grown-ups who had come outside to smoke, and I heard one of them say, "Poor guy, drunk as a skunk." Even then, deep in grief for my mother, I knew who they were talking about. Before Mom died, my father was what I'd call a regular drinker. I was just a little kid in the 2nd grade, so I suppose you have to take that with a grain of salt. But I stand by it. I never heard him slurring. He didn't stumble around the place. He didn't even go out to bars. And he never laid a hand on me or my mother. He would come home with his briefcase and Mom would give him a drink, usually a martini. She'd have 1, 2 in the evening. While we were watching TV, he might have a couple beers. That was it. All that changed after the goddamn bridge. He was drunk after the funeral, as a skunk. Drunk on Christmas and drunk on New Year's Eve, which, I found out later, people like him call amateur night. In the weeks and months after we lost her, he was drunk most of the time, mostly at home. He still didn't go out to bars at night. Too many assholes like me, he said once, and he still never laid a hand on me. But the booze was out of control. I know that now. Then I just accepted it. Kids do that. Dogs too. I found myself getting my own breakfast 2 mornings a week, then 4, then almost all the time. I'd eat alphabets or apple jacks in the kitchen and hear some snoring in the bedroom. Great big motorboat snores. Sometimes he forgot to shave before leaving for work. After dinner, more and more that was takeout. I'd hide his car keys if he needed a fresh bottle. He could walk down to the Zippy and get one. Sometimes I worried about him meeting a car on the goddamn bridge, but not too much, I was sure. Pretty sure at least, that both of my parents couldn't possibly get wiped out in the same place. My dad worked in insurance and I knew what actuarial tables were, figuring out the odds. He was good at his job, my dad, and he skated along for over 3 years in spite of his boozing. Did he get warnings at work? I don't know, but probably. Was he pulled over for driving erratically once the drinking started in the afternoon? If he was, maybe he was let off with a warning. Make that probably because he knew all the cops in town. Dealing with cops was part of his job. There was a rhythm to our lives during those 3 years. Maybe not a good rhythm, not the sort you'd want to dance to, but one I could count on. I'd get home from a school around there. My father would roll in around 5 with a few drinks already under his belt. And on his breath, he didn't go out to the bars at night. But I found out later he was a regular at Duffy's Tavern on his way home from the office. He'd bring a pizza or tacos or Chinese from Joy Fun. Some nights he'd forget and we'd order out. Or rather, I would. And after dinner, the real drinking would start. Mostly gin, other stuff if the gin was gone. Some nights he fell asleep in front of the TV. Some nights he'd stumble into the bedroom, leaving his shoes and rumpled suit coat for me to put away. Once in a while I'd wake up and hear him crying. It's pretty awful to hear that in the middle of the night. The crash came in 2006. It was a summer vacation. I had a shrimp league game at 10 in the morning, hit 2 home runs, and made an awesome catch. I came home just after noon and found my father already sitting there, sitting in his chair and staring at the TV, where old-time movie stars were having a duel on some castle stairs. He was in his undershorts and sipping a white drink that smelled to me like straight Gilbey's. I asked him what he was doing home. Still looking at the sword fight and hardly slurring at all, he said, "I seem to have lost my job, Charlie." Or, if I can quote Bobcat Goldthwait, "I know where it is, but someone else is doing it, or soon will be." I thought I didn't know what to say, but words came out of my mouth anyway. "Because of your drinking. I'm going to stop," he said. I just pointed at the glass. Then I went into my bedroom and shut the door and started to cry. That's gonna be all for today. But if you'd like me to continue this beautiful book, or if you're a fan of Stephen King, let me know in the comments. Hopefully soon I can get a nice little tripod or some kind of microphone going for the channel, but this is a pretty good test run of what I'm going to do on the channel for the future. I'm going to be reading at least once a week for you